Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of potentially many retrospective review and or analysis videos based upon games, shows, movies, anime, and manga. Pretty much whatever I feel like talking about at the time. For this episode, we're going to be covering the first episode of the 90s Spider-Man animated series. If any of you have not watched this show, I would very much recommend it. There is a bit of childhood bias on my side, but don't let that detract from my statements. I've introduced people to this series, and they've ended up actually being pretty fond of it as well. So let's talk a bit about what you guys are in for. In my original attempts to play out this idea was to go for a large-scale overview of the episode at hand and establish everything that went on throughout. I soon realized this was a bad idea, mainly due to the fact that it felt like I was leading my co-hosts around on a string, and that in turn made it hard for me to get them to interject with their own thoughts. So now I'm going for a much more general look at each thing I cover. So instead of talking about every event as it were, it's now about taking a look at the much larger picture as a whole. Things like theme, opposing forces, character development. This is mostly for the attempts to make sure anyone that is recording with me has a place to talk and not get bored hearing me talk. So with all that out of the way, let's get on with it. The first episode of Season 1, or Night of the Lizard, originally released on November 19th, 1994, with a runtime of 21 minutes. This episode was the attempt to be a launchpad in the much greater world of Spider-Man, which is a bit odd because according to some sources this is actually loosely based on issue 6 of The Amazing Spider-Man. I think the first thing I actually want to talk about is the art style. This art style appears to have its very common at the time 2D animation style, but spices things up with 3D renders of the city as Spider-Man traverses it from time to time. I'm not sure if Spider-Man was exactly the first to do it, but for me it's the first place where I've seen it before. I feel as though the areas where the city and the characters are drawn out still actually hold up pretty well. There are certain portions of the episode where the art feels a bit Disney, not in a bad way per se, but just kind of resembles it. As for the 3D rendered sections of the city are concerned, I don't think those parts quite hold up as well to me. As opposed to the drawn out parts, I would say the 3D animated parts feel kind of lifeless. I still think they have their own certain charm, and that's probably just due to my own nostalgia, but I still think it's okay. Just for a second, I'm going to fanboy a little bit about the voice of Spider-Man. Spider-Man and Peter are voiced by Christopher Daniel Barnes, and whenever I hear him making an appearance in games or other shows, it's an absolute treat. Anyways, this story is meant to be the platform, or the launchpad of the show, and does it do a particularly good job of that? I wouldn't say so. I feel as though their idea was to hook people in with the spectacle of the show versus actually building up the ideals of the main character, or for that matter, building up the world we are in as a whole. The only thing to really place us in the world that we're in is pretty much the very first line of the show.
New York City. If only everything down there was really as peaceful as it looks from up here.
The world buildup is not a super huge thing for me because most of the time in the episode it doesn't really make use of it anyways. The thing that is however important is building up Peter and Spider-Man of their motivations, ideals, and goals. Instead we get a very one-dimensional version of Peter that's not very fleshed out. If you're coming into this show already fully aware of who Spider-Man is and what motivates him, I don't think this really detracts from the episode too greatly. On the other hand, if you don't know much or anything at all about Spider-Man, I feel like this episode doesn't really do the character justice. So I wanted to very briefly mention a subway worker that gets kidnapped by the Lizard in the beginning. This should be one of the things that motivates Spider-Man to be the hero that the people need him to be. But when Spider-Man finds him, he says he'll come back for the worker later, only for us to never see the worker again. Did they forget about him?
Huh? Save me! Save me! Yeah, you'll come back for me, right? Hey, I'm the hero, remember?
There's no actual footage of Spider-Man coming back for that worker. Now let's talk about a character who's a bit more fleshed out. And that's the good Dr. Kirk Connors. And he even happens to be the opposing force of the episode as well. We get to know more about Connors through flashbacks Peter has throughout the episode. We find out he's a good-natured man trying to help the world through his invention, the neogenic recombinator. His goal is to help people around the world to potentially heal them of sickness or greater tragedy like his own. Dr. Connors is trying to gain his right arm back, and doesn't want anyone to go through the hardships that come with it. Knowing that alone grounds Dr. Connors as a very hardworking and caring person. We find out later that due to the use of reptile DNA and the neogenic recombinator, he was the man turned into the Lizard. Not at all because of the lab coat or the name tag or anything. In this episode we get an idea of what kind of person Dr. Connors is, but the same can't be said about Peter. We don't know how he became Spider-Man. The only reason we do is because of the intro theme in the beginning of the episode. So we know a bit about the cause of his powers, but that doesn't really explain why he took it upon himself to go out and stop/fight crime. This episode doesn't really explain Peter's loss fueling his motivations to do the right thing. So let's talk about Peter's motivations throughout the episode. Peter was given the task to get a picture of the lizard and interview Connors. The motivation here is that if Peter brings Jonah Jameson a photo of the lizard, he gets $1,000. Originally, he's thinking about using it for like a motorcycle or a down payment on a car or something like that, but then he finds out that Aunt May is kind of behind on bills because hard times. Now Peter's motivation shifts to Aunt May's priorities. Peter sets out to interview Connors only to get there to believe Doc Connors is actually being kidnapped by the lizard. At this time, he's with reoccurring character Deborah Whitman. After the lizard leaps from the window, Peter chases after him looking to jump out the window himself. Like, what are you gonna do, dog? Like, you're really gonna jump out a window in front of like a random person? Way to blow your cover. So now Peter's focus is to rescue Connors and to take that $1,000 photo. After this, he heads to the Connors residence to look for the professor, which makes no sense to me because you just thought you saw him get kidnapped. Soon enough, Spider-Man, Mrs. Connors, and son Billy hear the cries of Eddie Brock. This eventually leads into the first fight sequence of the episode. Spider-Man gets absolutely wrecked here, and then only for the lizard to retreat briefly. After this happens, it's openly stated that Doc Connors is the lizard. Eddie Brock overhears this, kind of hiding in the shadows, and runs off with his story, and Spider-Man pursues him. In that gap, the lizard takes Mrs. Connors to the sewers, which is essentially his home base. So now Spider-Man's focus is to save Mrs. Connors, stop the lizard, and save Doc Connors, and take that $1,000 picture. Spider-Man then pursues the lizard into the sewers. Okay, it's actually time for some character development on the side of Spider-Man. We as a watcher are clued into Peter's thoughts, vocalizing things like how he's actually afraid of the strength of the lizard. Not only does Peter have to fight that fear, but also get past the fact that somewhere inside the lizard is his friend. We soon find out the lizard's intentions, which are slightly more twisted versions of his original ones. I still feel the good nature of the character shining through. Funny enough, Mrs. Connors seems to start making a breakthrough, only for Spider-Man to fuck that all up by starting a fight. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the spectacle, or at least what I believe it to be. I love this fight sequence of the Spider-Man and the lizard battling out underwater over the neogenic recombinator. This fight may be a little bit short, but I love the choreography that is within, and I feel it's well complemented by the voiceover of Spider-Man's thoughts at this time. The fight sequence ends with the neogenic recombinator going off and Spider-Man fishing Connors out of the water. The neogenic recombinator going off will have lasting effects for quite some time, but as things are now, everything seems to have wrapped up nicely, with Spider-Man being the hero and the Connors family being reunited. And Peter gets that $1,000. But he uses that money to help Aunt May with her bills instead of personal gain. And that's pretty much a general look at the first episode of Spider-Man the Animated Series, Night of the Lizard. I'm a huge fan of this series. I am going to be doing more of these episodes of Spider-Man the Animated Series, so you can expect that in the future. If you guys just want more content in general, I have other channels you can check out in the description. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys later. Peace.